35 of those years. He's currently with the law firm of Meyer, Moose, and Tanick. A graduate of the University of Minnesota School of Journalism and Stanford Law School, Marshall was named as a notable alumnus and received an award of achievement from the university. And I might add, I think he's won an awful lot of awards too. He's also received the First Amendment Award from the Society of Professional Journalists and Authors Award from the Minnesota Bar Association. He's a longtime resident of Golden Valley and is involved in a variety of community activities here. He's a frequent contributor to the Star Tribune opinion page and the local Sun Post newspaper. He's also a history buff and likes to connect Minnesota to historical events. Today, in recognition of the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, he'll be doing exactly that. So welcome, Marshall, and I have a question for you. Where were you on November 22nd, 1960?
Well, you stole my punchline there. That's what I was going to ask everyone else. But everyone has memories that probably, not everyone in this room, but many of us do, and others have heard about it. Now let me just punch in here, so let me get started here. This is always a challenge for me to get on here, so you may need some help here. So just bear with me for a minute here. Can I talk while I'm doing this? I guess I can. Oops, not so good at this. Should have set this up before, but kind of stole my thunder here. Just a minute here. Oops. Can you come here for a minute? Someone to help me get set up here? Because I can't see the screen too well. I gotta erase that. Just gotta erase that and get that off there. I punched the wrong button there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excuse me here. Ooh,
you want me to do it all?
Yeah.
Solve it?
Yeah. Just erase that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. There you go.
Okay. Let me just try this one. I should have set this up beforehand, but excuse me. This might be interesting if we ever get started here. So I just tested this morning, so it should work. Okay, confines here. Oh boy.
Hit return. Enter.
Okay, there. Okay. Whoops, I typed something there. Whoops, went off. Get me back on there somehow.
Let's see.
Yeah, we just you get an X on that. An X on the top here, I think. That'll do. Should
Or
work.
we'll just do this.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Don't take the tour.
I'm not going to take the tour. Any suggestions, anyone?
The
Is
X.
it the X work at the top?
No, it's not working.
Tried a couple of times.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, thank you. Couple of thoughts here. First of all, happy Bucks time. I just want a couple people have already done this before, but I just want to thank Shep for his service of 12 years, and glad to contribute. I'm glad he's not running again because I spent a lot of money contributing to his past campaign, so I'm saving some money here. But $1 for Shep, and $1 for Shep, and another happy buck for Shep's good health and continued good health.
Thank you.
I tried acupuncture myself a few years ago. How many have had acupuncture here? And I was real dubious about it, and it kind of worked. It didn't hurt, let's put it that way. You know, the Hippocratic oath is do no harm. I'm not sure the acupuncture helped me, but it didn't get worse, so I guess I consider that a 50-50 deal. Today's subject is, as Peggy indicated, the JFK assassination. Timely topic. It's been 60 years. Most of us do remember where we were at the time. I'm giving this presentation to a number of other groups, including a few on November 22nd itself. But this is so you don't get an exclusive presentation here, but you get the first one. So this is kind of trial run. So I'm going to kind of work out the bugs with you folks here, with our Rotarians today. And this will be a little bit shorter. I have the presentation runs 60 to 90 minutes at its length, but this will be shorter than that. Believe me. Minnesota doesn't have any direct type of connections with the JFK assassination as New Orleans does, or Washington, D.C., or Dallas, but there are some fascinating intersections between Minnesota and the assassination. Most of those are little known, but they're important and interesting, and that's what I'm going to talk about. As some of you recall, I have a presentation like this about Watergate, the Minnesota connections, which are really suburban Hennepin County connections largely. But I have a presentation like that, and I also have a presentation on 9/11 in the Minnesota connection, so this is a version of that. But I'm going to try to tie much, but not everything, into Minnesota. And I think you'll see that there's some connections and intersections that people may not have been aware of. Let's see if I can move this thing. Oh, how do I move this here? Pardon me here. Now I'm gonna need some more help to move this thing. Huh?
What we could do is,
There we go.
Got it.
I guess I got those spots on there and everything, so, oh, but I think you can read it,
You
can't
put
you?
it in the presentation.
Can you read it? Okay.
It's not actually a PowerPoint, it's a PDF.
yeah, it's a PDF. No, we can read that.
You can read it?
Yep.
Can you see it? Okay, all right, well, okay. We all kind of know the facts about the assassination. It happened on November 22nd, 1963 at 12:31 actually p.m. Central Standard Time, Dealey Plaza. Remember the Texas School Book Depository? There was a clock on top of this building that did say 12:31. That's when the 3 or more shots were fired. And the president died shortly thereafter, a half hour later, at Parkland Hospital. Kennedy's trip to Texas was twofold. One was the Democratic Party in Texas, and there used to be a Democratic Party in Texas, for those of you who follow politics, was really split and going through a lot of dysfunctionality and disputes. There was the Lyndon Johnson wing of the party. That's the old established group of the party. A conservative wing of the party. Johnson was two cars behind Kennedy in the Watergate. And there was the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, which was represented by a fellow named Senator Ralph Yarborough and others. So the tug and pull in the Democratic Party in Texas back then was between the establishment, sort of conservative Democrats, and the liberal Democrats. And Kennedy went down there to try to patch up that rift a bit. And he also was down there for fundraising, and it was a political year, and the election was 1 year away, so he was down there to do a little bit of political campaigning as well. The last words that the president said were, Mrs. Connolly, who was sitting in front of him in that jump seat, we all remember that. Mrs. Connolly, John Connolly's wife, turned to him as they made that turn in front of the school book depository. The crowds were thinning out at that point. The biggest crowds were right in downtown, this was on the edge of downtown. And she said, well, Mr. President, you sure can't say Dallas doesn't love you. And his response was, no, you cannot. And then the shots rang out at that point. The Warren Commission did an investigation. President Johnson set up the Warren Commission right after the assassination, although it wasn't immediately after assassination. During that first week, there were some purported investigations that were getting started. J. Edgar Hoover was having an FBI investigation. The state of Dallas had commissioned some people to investigate. So things were going on in those first few days. But within a week, Johnson said, hey, we're gonna have too many investigations, there's too much going on, let's centralize this into a one unit investigation. It wasn't a criminal investigation because it was too late to have a criminal investigation. Oswald had been shot by Ruby, who later was charged and convicted of murder, and that was reversed, by the way. So that's how the Warren Commission came about. And the Warren Commission, as we all know, found that the assassination was a product of a single lone conspirator, Lee Harvey Oswald. 15 years later, Congress did an investigation, a select House committee, and they came to sort of the same conclusion, maybe possibly. The congressional investigation, which happened in 1978, reinvestigated the assassination of both Presidents Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and it concluded that it basically validated the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald did it, shooting from the Texas School Book Depository with that famous single bullet theory. They had to explain how one bullet hit, there were only 3 shots that Oswald could have taken from there. One missed entirely, one was a kill shot, but there was another shot that hit both Kennedy and Connolly. And the Warren Commission's explanation was the shot went through Kennedy's back, came out through his throat, and struck John Connolly sitting in front of him. Without that explanation, there couldn't have been one shooter and one assassin, because there was only time enough to get off 3 shots, according to the Zapruder film. But at any rate, the House committee investigated and came to essentially the same conclusions. They validated what the Warren Commission said, that Oswald was the only shooter, but they added one other feature. They said there was, quote, probably, unquote, a conspiracy. Well, that's kind of enticing, but they didn't say who the conspirators were. The suggestion was somehow that the mafia or the organized crime was behind it, but they didn't go quite that far. They said, we think there was a conspiracy here, probably was the word they used, but they didn't say who it was. And there's all kinds of theories as to who did it and who didn't do it. Castro in Cuba, and the mafia, and the mob, and white supremacists, and Southern oil men, and LBJ was behind it. Lots of different theories. Many of them coalesced in the movie JFK, which was a 1992 movie by Oliver Stone. There also was, of course, another legal proceeding, and that was the New Orleans one with big Jim Garrison. Remember that one? He charged a New Orleans businessman, Clay Shaw, with having kind of masterminded the assassination. And Garrison, who was the district attorney for New Orleans, asserted that the assassination was a conspiracy by some New Orleans business people and other people, including the CIA and others. There were kind of a muddled mess there. And there was an actual trial. That's the only trial that came out of this, the assassination. And there was a trial of Clay Shaw, a New Orleans businessman, and he was acquitted in 51 minutes. The jury was out for 51 minutes. It usually takes that long just for the jury to get seated and introduce themselves. So it was kind of a slam dunk. So the jury came back and acquitted Clay Shaw of the assassination. However, off the record, a number of jurors, based on the evidence that was submitted there, said they thought there was a conspiracy too, but they said this is the right guy. So that's what happened in the New Orleans investigation. Right, Chef? Pretty much? At any rate, Oliver Stone's movie, JFK in 1992, and most people see it, it's probably been around for a while too. It came out and it really brought all these conspiracies together. I mean, it was Oliver Stone's account of the assassination, but he wove in all these different conspiracy theories into his movie. And it was a very popular movie, and it did very well at the box office, had big time stars. Kevin Costner played James Garrett. Remember Jim Garrison. Donald Sutherland was in it, and Kevin Bacon. A lot of other characters were in it. And good actors. It was a well done movie, and it did very well at the box office. It also raised a lot of public consciousness about the assassination, which had been dormant for a long period of time. As you recall, after the Warren Commission came out with its report, and during the next decades, there was all these conspiracy theories, Rush to Judgment, remember Mark Lane, and all these books that came out, and reenactments, and various theories. And ultimately, the public opinion polls by the 1980s and 90s, and they've been about the same now, they're not asking this question anymore, was 70% of the population thought there was a conspiracy. They didn't accept the Warren Commission's theory. They thought there was a conspiracy, but they couldn't quite figure out who did it. So there's been this lingering doubt about it. And Oliver Stone's movie really launched more doubt. It also led to a congressional enactment of what was called the JFK Assassination Records Collections Act, because there's still at that time there were thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of documents related to the whole affair that had still been concealed and not been produced by the FBI and the CIA. So Congress, in response to the JFK movie, set up this agency called the Records Collection Bureau to review all of these JFK records that were still hidden and decide which ones could be classified, which ones couldn't, which ones could be accessible to the media and the public because of these remaining doubts about what really happened in the assassination. The person who was appointed to head the Assassinations Records Committee was Minnesota, here we come, Judge John Thunheim. Judge John Thunheim is a longtime Minnesotan. He was a member of the Attorney General's office for many, many years, very good attorney. And he was appointed a federal judge in the 1980s. He's been a federal judge for 40 years. At the time, he was still a fairly young federal judge back in 1992. And he was appointed to head the commission that was tasked with going through all of these remaining JFK records and deciding which ones should be classified and which ones shouldn't, which ones are national security matters, which ones aren't, in response to concerns raised by by the media and other folks. So that was Minnesota's connection. I know the Judge Thunheim fairly well, and I've asked him how he became involved in that. And it was just through some political connections. He was well connected, but it wasn't really a political job. It just people knew him. He had been a judge for about 8 years at that time. Was a well-regarded judge. Had a lot of legal experience arguing cases before the Supreme Court. So he was the one who was selected and put a Minnesota gloss on the assassination of Kennedy because he ran that agency through here in Minnesota. He still remained a federal judge, but his part-time job was handling the Records Commission for on the Kennedy assassination. Two other significant Minnesota connections were men from northern Minnesota. I'll start with the second one on the list here, if you can see it. Yeah, UMD professor James Fetzer. As I mentioned, and we all remember, all these conspiracy theories that sprouted after the Kennedy assassination. There was the mafia, there was the mob, there was the CIA, that Oswald was innocent, that Jack Ruby was a member of the mob, and Oswald was killed as a hit job by the mob. All these different theories, and books and other books and literature and movies and television series and the like, created a great deal of doubt, and it resulted in about 2/3 of the public or more not believing that Oswald was the assassin, or if he was, it was part of a conspiracy. I think I'll stop here before I get to my next point. This is a good time to ask a question. Okay, public poll here. How many accept the view that Oswald was the assassin, alone, single assassin, no connections, he did it? Here, yeah. I'm asking you now. How many think that was it? It was one man, one shooter, 4, 5, 3, 4, okay. How many think it wasn't? How many think there was more to it than that? There was some kind of conspiracy. It wasn't just Oswald up in the books depository himself. How many? Just raise your hand. Okay, who did it? Well, if you don't think, and I'm not saying how I feel, I may, but if you believe that there was some kind of conspiracy, that's fine. Most people do. But then the next step is, okay, who did it? As I said already, Congress couldn't answer that question. They had a year-long investigation. They came up with the conclusion that it was probably somebody, but they don't know who. So, of all you folks who just raised your hand, tell me who you think was behind this. Go ahead, Brian.
Mafia connection with Cuba, because Bautista had just been run out of Cuba. All of the Mafia's gambling operations had to leave Havana and go to Las Vegas. So that, I couldn't give you a name.
And there have been some names floated. There's some names floated, including Carlos Marcello, right? Shep, who's Carlos Marcello?
Oh, well, he's no longer alive, but the Marcello family is a well-known mafia family in New Orleans.
Yeah, that was why New Orleans was a big thing. And Oswald spent some time in New Orleans, and Oswald had family in New Orleans. In fact, Oswald was born in New Orleans. So Oswald had New Orleans connections. Okay, well that's Brian's theory, if you want to call it that. I wouldn't put it up there with the theory of relativity, but but that's okay. That's a common theory. That is probably the most prevalent theory, that there was this mafia Cuba connection, and that's probably the theory that most people have. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Some people say it was the CIA. They were dissatisfied with Kennedy's response or non-response in Vietnam. So Cuba's a hot spot, but Vietnam is also considered a source for the Kennedy assassination by some of the conspiracy folks who say it was a CIA concoction because they wanted to escalate the war in Vietnam, which Kennedy was not inclined to do at that time, so he said. And Oswald had some CIA connections, and that's where some of these records were bore upon Oswald's CIA connection. So that's another possible source of the, quote, probable, unquote, conspiracy. Yeah, back to you, Brian.
I think Bay of Pigs was more involved with the CIA connection than Vietnam.
Well, that too. Yeah, that too. Okay, anyone else?
Because Kennedy completely screwed up the Bay of Pigs.
Oh, yeah.
He was trying to do what he thought was morally right.
Yeah.
But the CIA and the partisans were supposed to have a successful invasion and could have and should have, except for Kennedy's intervention with the Air Force.
Yeah,
he
called off the air support, in the Bay of Pigs. Anyone else have anyone weigh in on that? Well, yeah, go ahead.
I think the Soviet Union at the time, I don't know if they were necessarily directly involved, but they definitely had some influences in the New Orleans area and with Lee Harvey Oswald. He may have been brainwashed, encouraged.
And Oswald did visit the Russian embassy in Mexico City, and 2 weeks before, not 2 weeks, about 4 weeks before the assassination, and he didn't just walk in there by accident. I mean, there was a planned trip to Mexico. So all kinds of. Well, who was a supporter of the single bullet, single person theory here? Who was that? Who's a Warren Commission supporter, kind of? Okay, go ahead. Tell us why.
I haven't thought about it for a long
For
time.
60 years. Okay, well, this is your chance to think about it. Yeah, okay. Well, think about it and come up with an answer later. You don't have to come up with an answer. All right. But the reason I mean is that all of these conspiracyologists, one of the main conspiracyologists was a Minnesotan. So we're talking about Minnesota connection. His name was his name was Professor John Fetzer. You can look him up on the internet. Professor James Fetzer was a distinguished, world-renowned, international renowned professor of the philosophy of science. That's the name of his discipline there. I didn't know there was one. But he taught up at UMD. He taught at a lot of different universities, but he ended up at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and that's where he lives. He's retired now, but he still lives in Duluth. You can go visit his house there. James Fetzer was one of the leading conspiracy people among that whole gaggle of conspiracy people. Mark Lane, you remember that name, and there's Epstein and other people. And he promoted the theory, but he was kind of way out on the outlier. But his theory, which he wrote a book about and gave public lectures on and spoke vociferously about, he's probably one of the top 5 conspiracy people. His theory was that it was a, quote, government hit, unquote. He called it a CIA job. He also was of the mind that the Zapruder film, which we've all seen numerous times, the Zapruder film, he said, was a fake. It was fake, and it was doctored to show a sequence that didn't really happen that way, to cover up the fact that the shots came from the front. Remember the grassy knoll rather than from the back. And there's some evidence that supports that, and some that doesn't. But he was a leading conspirologist, and he's still up from the University of Minnesota Duluth, and he became, as I said, one of the top 3 or 4 or 5. Oops. Uh-oh. Did I lose it here? Oh no. Okay. One of the 3 or 4 or 5 conspiracy leaders in the country. On the other hand, there's another Minnesotan who took a different view. Vincent Bugliosi, Minnesotan. Who is he? Well, what do you think about, first of all, when you hear his name? Vincent Bugliosi.
Mom.
What? Mob, okay. Well, there was sort of a mob, but it wasn't that mob. Which mob was it? The Charles Manson gang. Bugliosi was a Hibbing native, Iron Ranger, 1951 state high school tennis champion, migrated out to the West Coast, went to law school at UCLA, became a prosecutor in the LA Attorney's Office. He was one generation in front of Chris Darden and Marcia Clark. Remember those names?
Yes.
He was one generation before the OJ prosecutors, all right? And he was a lead prosecutor, one of the lead prosecutors in the Los Angeles Attorney's Office, Los Angeles County Attorney's Office, prosecuting cases. And he had a record, so they say, he had 104 murder cases, and he won 103, so he said, right? So he was their top guy, top gun, literally and figuratively. Well, then comes Charles Manson. That name ring a bell at all? All right. He was the prosecutor in the Charles Manson case. Okay? Remember that? Sharon Tate, the LaBianca family, all that. Right? He was the lead prosecutor. That case went on for a year, and he made his fame by winning that case. He was well known out there anyway, but he was a national celebrity at that point. And that was the last case he ever tried, by the way. Just like Chris Darden in the OJ case, Marcia Clark in the OJ case, F. Lee Bailey in the OJ case, Robert Shapiro in the OJ case, Johnny Cochran in the OJ case. None of them ever tried a case after the OJ case. They were still involved in law, but that was the last time they were in a courtroom for a trial. But anyway, Bugliosi, the same thing. Bugliosi then retired and became an author. And he wrote a number of books, mainly true crime books, historical true crime books, and other books as well. And one of the books he wrote was called 4 Days in Dallas. And in his book, this is the guy from Hibbing, Minnesota, he refuted the conspiracy people. He took the opposite view. He took the view that the Warren Commission got it right, that it wasn't any conspiracy. It was a single lone gunman. It was Oswald. Oswald was a disgruntled person. He never figured out his motive, but it was Oswald up in the school book depository on the 6th floor. Case closed. It's the case closed in the sense that he wrote it. It was an 843-page book. I read it. I counted the pages, but it was a very thorough analysis of the Warren Commission report, and it supported the Warren Commission report. So here you have 2 of the leaders in the post-assassination issues. Fetzer, leading conspiracy guy from Duluth, Bugliosi from Hibbing, taking the opposite view. And those are a couple of the people from Minnesota who played a role in the conspiracy, in the post-assassination considerations. Another Minnesota connection of sort was, as a result of the assassination of President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, of course, became president, and the vice presidency was vacant. And at that time, there was no way, the law didn't have a provision to fill a vice presidency vacancy. In fact, during our history, there have been 8 times when there's been no vice president, because they died, or in one case, John C. Calhoun, who quit as vice president because he was upset with Andrew Jackson, and then came back to be vice president a second time. But there have been vacancies in vice presidency before, and at that time, and now, the law provided that if the successor to the president is the vice president, but there's no vice president, the successor is a Speaker of the House. That's still the law, by the way. The Speaker of the House is third in line, but there was no second in line there, so the Speaker was second in line. The Speaker at that time was John McCormick, a Massachusetts politician who was 81 years old and not in great shape. So to fill the vacancy in the vice presidency, Congress proposed and the country approved the 25th Amendment. That's the amendment that allows the president, if there's a vacancy in the vice presidency, the president nominates someone to the Senate, and the Senate picks a new vice president. And the first time that law, the first vice president that operated under that law was Hubert Humphrey. Of course, he didn't become president, but the law went into effect when Humphrey was the vice president. The leading opponent to that law at the time was Walter Mondale. Mondale was against that law. He later came on, later in his life he said he made a mistake, he shouldn't have opposed it, but he did at the time. So it was Humphrey and Mondale were on opposite sides of that issue, how to fill the vacancy in the vice presidency. The first person to fill the vacancy that way was whom? You historians. Gerald Ford. Remember, Spiro Agnew resigns. Nixon then appoints Gerald Ford as the vice president. And then Agnew resigns, Nixon appoints Ford, Ford gets approved by Congress, and Ford became vice president. Nixon then, of course, resigns, not of course, Nixon resigns, Ford becomes president. Incidentally, Ford was a member of the Warren Commission. And so in 1976, Ford runs again for president against Jimmy Carter. And who was Jimmy Carter's vice president that year? Walter Mondale. So 6 degrees of separation here at work, folks. So kind of the connections are all over the place. That provision hasn't been used. The 25th Amendment provides for filling the vacancy of vice president. It changes the presidential succession a little bit, but not much. Speaker of the House is still third in line. It also provides for the disability provision. If a majority of the cabinet determines that the president is disabled or unable to effectively be president, they can remove the president temporarily and appoint the vice president to fill the presidency. There's been some talk in past administration of possibly doing that, but it's never been used. It's a weird provision because what it provides for is the cabinet removes the president, the vice president becomes president, but the president then in 30 days can come back and petition to be put back in the role of president. That would make an interesting situation, wouldn't it? Can you imagine that? A vice president and president disagreeing and fighting over who becomes president? Couldn't happen here, would it? Can't imagine that happening. All right, so a few other Minnesota-related matters. There have been a spate of cases through the years involving threats to the president. And they're all over the map, literally and figuratively. And they basically stem from the JFK assassination. At that time, as you recall, there was no federal law prohibiting injuring or killing a president or any federal officer. It was all state matter. That's why that whole New Orleans investigation took place. That's why the Warren Commission was put in place to prevent a Texas investigation that might not get to the bottom of the matter. But JFK's murder, or assassination, was a murder in the state of Texas. There was no federal law at the time. As a result of that, there's a federal law now against injuring or killing a president, vice president, member of Congress, so on and so forth. But that law went into effect after the JFK assassination. There's been a spate of cases over the years with people being charged with threatening the president. And interestingly, and I've done some research on this, I haven't categorized everything, The Eighth Circuit seems to be ground zero for that. The Eighth Circuit is the federal circuit. As you know, the country is divided geographically into different federal units. The Eighth Circuit is the federal court unit that governs Minnesota and the middle part of the country, basically. Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Missouri, and Arkansas. They're all in the Eighth Circuit. There have been twice as many presidential threat cases in the Eighth Circuit, Minnesota and surrounding states, than anywhere else in the country. Go explain that one. It's hard to explain it. But these are some of the kinds of cases that have come through, and every president since Kennedy has been subject to assassination or other kinds of threats, from including, of course, Reagan was shot. But there have been a number of these cases. They come up through the federal court system, and the majority, not the majority, but a disproportionate number of these cases have all been Minnesota or Minnesota-related cases. And here's examples of a few of those.
Partial Guinea.
Yeah, so here's some more Minnesota connections. I'm running out of time, and I'll conclude by saying, who do you think did it? I've already asked that question, you've already answered it, and now you can all talk amongst yourself if you haven't already. Where were you when you heard about the assassination of President Kennedy? Think back about it. It was 60 years ago this month. Time flies, doesn't it? Thank you. My time is over now too. I appreciate your patience in listening to me, hearing me out. And if you have any suggestions or comments, I'd be glad to hear them, because I'm going to be giving this to some other groups as well. But you're the first.
Where were you, Marshall?
I have a boring story. I mean, most probably do. I mean, I was in high school, and it was lunch hour, and I was walking in the hallway to my next class, and someone said to me, and I remember who it was and what they said, "Did you hear what happened to President Kennedy?" And I said, "No, what happened?" He said, "He got shot." And I said, "Where?" And the person, I didn't know where he was. I thought it was the White House, and he said, "In the head." It doesn't sound so good. And then somehow I ended up in the gymnasium in our school, and they had a television, one of those old, 14 by 18 televisions, and we were watching Walter Cronkite in the gymnasium. So that's my story. Well, anyone have a real interesting story? Pretty much mundane, that's how you heard about it back then. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the